One of the great achievements of the modern world is the dramatic decline in slavery. Slavery is a moral abomination, but it's been practiced by pretty much every culture in every part of the world for millennia and millennia. And then in a relatively short period of time, just a few centuries, a blink of an eye in historical time, this widespread and unquestioned practice was challenged. It was put on the defensive, and then it was largely defeated in the civilizing parts of the world and relegated to underground status in the semi- and uncivilized parts of the world. But its legacy is still with us naturally, but it's also infecting our current cultural and political discussions. Now, partly it's an issue of the debates over the history of slavery and how to evaluate the past, but partly it is an issue of our debates about our self-evaluation and policies today. Now, both time eras, past and present, the question of one's moral status as an individual and as a member of a culture highlighted. What is your moral responsibility as an individual and as a member of some collection of humans? Does it matter what kind of collection we're talking about, whether you're born into it or whether it's one that you have chosen to belong to? Do the past practices of other members of those groups affect you? And if so, how? Now, slavery is a great moral stain on human history, but how should someone living today think about it? Decent individuals, that's most of us, take our history seriously. But there is an additional importance to the history, as some politically motivated groups use past slavery as a guilt weapon against others. So, how should these guilt and shame charges be evaluated? Now, some history is relevant here, and the important point is that pretty much all groups across history practiced slavery. Everywhere you look, sub-Saharan Africa for a long, long time, millennia and millennia, both East and West, North African. You look at the Arabic cultures, you look at Persia, you look at the Indian subcontinent, East Asia, North Asia, the Eurasian landmass, the early Americas. Slavery is everywhere. The centuries roll along, the millennia roll along, and it's hard. It's useful to draw out a timeline, just to see how long the stretches of history that we are talking about, and project that onto a map of the world to see just how ubiquitous the practice of slavery was and how unquestioned it was. Just relatively recently, and we now call slaves in contemporary times, but that use arose perhaps about 1,000 years ago, and there's an interesting historical etymological quirk about that. Why do we call slaves slaves? Well, partly it's because from Middle English and the Latin, so many people in European history were of Slavic origin from that part of the world, that name stuck. The particular ethnic group came to be more generically applied to people who had the status of slavery. Now, this is modern times, and I'm going to focus more on the North American debates, given my particular geographical location, so the debates that I'm most engaged with. And in modern times, and for North America, it's the Atlantic slave trade from Africa that is the most significant. Millions and millions of Africans were enslaved and transported to the Americas, so naturally that looms large in our history. It's worth noting, though, that a smaller number of white slaves did come from Europe to North America. That number is estimated by scholars as being about 300,000 individuals. That's not an insignificant number, but it's definitely a smaller group and should not be overlooked as well. But if we're going to do a full look at slavery in modern times in the Atlantic trade, we have to focus on four groups. There are the slaves themselves. There are the people who initially captured and made the slaves slaves. There are the traders and transporters of the slaves across the Atlantic, and then there are the eventual buyers and users of the slaves. So let's work our way through these four groups. Where did the slaves come from initially, the millions who eventually were transported? The vast majority of them came from the interior of Africa. And the important history here is that there were organized systems inside of Africa, powerful kingdoms, powerful empires that had been around for a long, long time, who practiced slavery. In West Africa alone, it's worth pointing out the Fawn people and the kingdom of Dahomey from roughly 1600 until about 1894. So almost 4 centuries centered around what is now Benin. This was a powerful kingdom that was based explicitly on slavery and conquest. The empire and kingdom of the Ashanti, for about a 3 centuries long kingdom and empire, now centered around what is now Ghana. It was an absolute monarchy that practiced slavery. The kingdom of the Congo, even more substantial, a substantial state for a longer period of time, from about the late 1300s, 1390 or so, to the eve of World War I, on into the early 20th century. It was a huge slave population that existed long before the arrival of the Portuguese and some other Europeans. Lots were then sold to the Portuguese. Most of the slaves were taken in conquest by the Congo as the Congo expanded their territory. Further to the south, in what is now centered around Angola, the Mubundu of Ndongo. Further to the south, centered on what is now Angola, the Mubundu people of the kingdom of Ndongo. They had some free commoners in their society who lived amongst 2 large subordinate classes, serfs who were tied to the land and slaves who could be sold. Now, the Ndongo were tributaries of the Congo, so early in the 1500s, when the Portuguese were making their presence felt up and down West Africa, the Ndongo welcomed the Portuguese and sought assistance and formed alliances with them because they were trying to, of course, get their independence from the powerful Congo. And there were several others. If we go over to the east side of Africa, there's a whole independent history there as well, with major slave ports and long histories in Mozambique, Zanzibar, and Madagascar. And when we read the history, it's the same history that we read in other parts of the world, where slavery arises from the usual mix of conquering, subjugation, selling people for money, taking wives, and so on. Now, the 1790s, if we say here's the height of the African slave trade, there was one early white European who traveled to some interior parts of West Central Africa, Mungo Park, and based on his estimates, he judged that approximately 75% of the populations in the areas that he traveled to, 75% were slaves, and only about 25% of the people there were free people. And just to put this in historical context as well, this is in the 1790s. The U.S. Civil War is not going to happen for another 75 years in the future. It won't end until 1865. Also from 1790s perspective, putting in context, it's not going to be for another 80 years or so that we get the Henry Stanley and David Livingstone saga, when they finally met in the interior of Africa in 1871. And that meeting was, of course, of worldwide interest because here we had some white men who were going where few or no white men had ever gone before. And the point with respect to the slave trade is that the internal slave trade was entirely an African affair. Slaves were then brought to the coast and then sold for export to the Europeans, to the Arabs, to the Indians, to the North and South Americans. Professor Henry Louis Gates, the chair of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, said this recently, quote, "Without complex business partnerships between African elites and European traders and their commercial agents, the slave trade to the New World would have been impossible." So the moral point here is that the blame for slavery is widespread. It's not a European alone or American alone or African alone shame. And for those who think racially, it's not a white only or a black only or a brown only problem. Internally to Africa, the stain of slavery is upon the many, many Africans across centuries who took slaves, used slaves, and sold slaves. And externally, from the slave ports in Africa to their destinations around the world, the buyers of slaves and the traders of slaves are also badly stained. Now let's look at some numbers, partly for perspective, because the numbers are shocking, but they're also important to evaluating ourselves in contemporary times. So if we go from roughly 1650 to 1860, that's about a 200-year stretch. Scholars estimate that approximately 11 million, but likely more, slaves were transported. Where they went, about 50% of the Atlantic slave trade was slaves who went to South America, largely Brazil. But about half of all of the slaves that came out of Africa went to South America. Another 41% went to the West Indies. Now that then is to say 91% of all of the slaves coming out of West Africa are going either to the West Indies or to South America. Where did the remaining 9% go? About 4% of them went to North America, about 3% went to Europe, and then about 2% went to Central America. Now, to me, when I first read those numbers, they were shocking because, of course, my focus as a North American has been learning on and hearing all my life about the slave practice in North America. But there's an issue here about how to process these ratios of, say 50% of the slaves went to South America and 4% went to North America. That's about a 12-to-1 ratio. How do we make that perspective judgment without denying the terrible responsibility of those who did it on a smaller scale? And we should be able to say two things, right? Slavery was a great moral stain to those who practiced it, but at the same time, there are huge scale differences to how much slavery was practiced in North compared to South America. But let's not forget the various kinds of analogies, right? You steal $100, that makes you a thief. But you steal $10,000, well, that makes you a thief, only worse. You kill a person, that makes you a murderer, right? You're a murderer. But if you kill 10 people, right, or 12 people, well, you're a murderer, but a much worse murderer. Now also, though, the historical evaluation does turn on the important things that started to happen, especially by the time we get to the 1700s.
This July, Professor Stephen Hicks is coming to New York. Join him in a live debate discussing whether postmodernism is necessary for apolitics of individual liberty. For the negative, Professor of Philosophy at Rockford University, Executive Director of the Center of Ethics and Entrepreneurship, and Senior Scholar at the Atlas Society, Stephen Hicks is author of numerous books and published articles on the subject. His opponent for the affirmative will be Thaddeus Russell, a PhD history graduate from Columbia University who heads Renegade University and whose work has been published in multiple mainstream media channels. If you're in New York at the time, seeing these two scholars in a live debate is something you won't want to miss. The event will be held on July 15th at the Subculture Theatre on Bleecker Street, starting at 6:30 p.m, and seating must be reserved in advance. To reserve your spot, go to www.thesohoforum.org. Scroll down to the event on Monday, July 15th, and simply click on the Buy Tickets link. And while you're online, please give the podcast a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or Google Play, and follow us on our social networks at Open College Podcast. Now, back to the podcast.
What's important in the 1700s, perhaps stretching back to the 1600s as well, is that for the first time in history, we see the beginnings of protests against slavery. And as a matter of principle, of course, in history, there were lots and lots of people who did not want to be slaves, but they didn't reject the practice in general, or they themselves, right, would have taken slaves if, say, the war that they had been captured in and made slaves, if the war had gone the other way. The principled objection to slavery is a huge advance into the moral credit of those individuals and nations who took those first steps. For the first time in history, we find moral condemnation about the predation and the collectivisms, the tribal, the ethnic, and racial versions of collectivism that were embodied in the practice of slavery. And the astonishing thing and the very interesting historical question is, why is this happening in the 1600s and the 1700s especially, and why only in a few particular places in the world? And the places that are most worth focusing on here are the early Americas, particularly the early North Americans, the British, and the French. So if we go to the Americas, colonies in the early 1700s, we find many of those who are starting to morally challenge the practice of slavery are Quakers and deists, such as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is, of course, now a polarizing but very important transition figure here. Very good in the ideas and the intellectual advocacy, very strong in his moral condemnation of slavery, but quite weak in his activist follow-through and in personal practice. But to give a sense of his principled moral opposition to slavery, here's a line, quote, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and that his justice cannot sleep forever. Commerce between master and slave is despotism. Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free." Now, in the early generations of the 1700s, what we have is mostly some isolated individuals who come to be convinced that slavery is wrong. In the next generations, we start to find them becoming activists in the formation of societies when there's enough people, and this is especially in the 1780s, where there are anti-slavery societies coming into existence and starting to make themselves felt and noticed. Similarly, if we jump across the Atlantic to Britain in the 1700s, we start to see, again, some individuals and some pushback against slavery on moral grounds. There's the very important 1772 Somerset case in which a judge found that chattel slavery was not supported by British common law. 1770s. Wilberforce in the 1780s, part of an emerging anti-slavery society. In 1789, when he became a member of Parliament, he spoke vigorously about the wretchedness and inhumanity of the slave trade. And the point is that at that point he was largely a lone voice speaking in Parliament, and his words fell largely upon deaf ears. It took Wilberforce and his allies 2 decades of activism, and the result was that about 18 years later, Parliament finally passed its Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. And here's a short excerpt from 1807. Quote, "Be it therefore enacted, right, from and after the first day of May 1807, the African slave trade and all manner of dealing and trading in the purchase, sale, barter, or transfer of slaves, or of persons intended to be sold, transferred, used, or dealt with as slaves, practiced or carried on in, at, to, or from any part of the coast or countries of Africa shall be, and the same is hereby utterly abolished, prohibited, and declared to be unlawful." And so we are now into the early 1800s. And so over the course of the previous century, some individuals and then some movements, and then finally an official government of a major nation declares slavery to be unlawful. I recommend the movie Amazing Grace for a personalized focus on William Wilberforce and the battle against slavery. It's very moving. As a result of that, the British government then deployed the British Navy over the course of several decades-long battle at great expense and a worldwide extent, but especially out of West and East Africa, and the British Navy's efforts around Africa over the next 50 years, taking us into the 1850s. The British captured at least 2,000 slave ships and freed approximately 250,000 Africans from further being transported around the world. The French also are notable here. They were also early. They abolished slavery in 1794, but over the next 80 years or so, the French record is rather mixed as they went back and forth on slavery, both in France and in their colonies and places where their influence was felt around the world. Now, that's some dates and individuals and names and acts of government. What are the lessons of history? Well, there are a few. The first is that it takes time and it takes steps, and there's no easy and automatic abolishment of slavery. From an early 21st century perspective, it's very easy for us to be impatient and morally condemnatory about the fact that slavery was not abolished easily and overnight and instantly. But that's just not the way history works. It always requires some brave and few intelligent, free-thinking individuals to question a long-standing practice, and that's exactly what happened in the case of slavery. Those individuals are intellectual and moral heroes for doing so. It then takes some energetic individuals to start to form a movement, usually against great inertia and outright opposition, to engage in the cultural education and the political activism. And these things often occur in degrees. It's not the case that the whole practice is entirely eliminated. First, there's no transporting of slaves, or there's no importing of slaves, or there's particular legislations about slaves of this kind, or that particular group. Or as we are making, say, new American states or expanding into new colonies, we will or won't allow slavery in the new places. Then we start to put pressure on foreign governments to stop their own slave practices, to attack the slave ports, to engage in, as in the case of the Americans, a civil war, or to engage in foreign war. And so all of these steps take place, and they take place sometimes one step forward, a step backward, two step forwards, and so on. Second major lesson is that the first and major movements against slavery were the nations that most embodied, most practiced, and most were affected by the Enlightenment of the 1700s. So if we ask the question, why did anti-slavery not start to occur until late 1600s and on into the 1700s? And why only in a few places in the world? Why is it an early modern achievement? And the point seems to be that it is precisely in the nations most of the Enlightenment, the British, the French, and the Americas. That's where we find the voices most against slavery, the movements most against slavery, and again, the political action as well. Now, there's an interesting question here about religion and its role. Does religion get credit for the battles against slavery? And the answer is no and yes. I think no for most of the traditional religions and long-standing institutionalized religions. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, they'd been around for centuries and millennia prior to the 1700s, and they had no problem with the institution of slavery. And you don't find their leading intellectuals attacking slavery and forming movements, and the places where they are politically institutionalized doing anything to get rid of the practice of slavery. What you do find in the 1600s and 1700s among the Quakers and many of the other low church sects, Wilberforce, for example, I believe he was a Methodist, and among the deists, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and others, that you find some principled opposition to slavery. But what you have then is some religious movements, again, in the modern world, who are strongly imbued with the notion of religious toleration and thinking for yourself, and the kind of moral individualism that goes with those approaches to religion. And that can be a good fit for being an anti-slavery person. But the most important factors in the modern world are the rise of humanism and liberalism, culminating in the Enlightenment of the 1700s. The emphasis on reason and the fact that all human beings have the capacity for reason, and the exercise of it is morally significant. The rise of individualism and the tolerationism, and the rise of the principles of freedom in economic and political and other cultural spheres. Those Enlightenment beliefs are the ones that get most of the credit for recognizing the stain and moral abomination that is slavery, and then doing something about it.
In his book, Entrepreneurial Living, 15 stories of innovation, risk, and achievement, and one story of abject failure, Professor Stephen Hicks has put together a series of interviews with entrepreneurs from 6 different countries and 7 US states to explore the adventure and the hard-headedness of business. In this book, Hicks explores what makes for entrepreneurial success and failure. To what extent does success depend on the key decisions, ideas, persistent action, or character traits? How does one's business life fit into one's overall life? And how does one even define success? Our belief is that we can always learn from the accomplishments and setbacks of others. The life stories from others can be informative, cautionary, and inspirational, as we each strive to more fully realize our own potentials and achieve our own goals. The 16 entrepreneurs featured in this book are widespread geographically as well as in the range of their endeavors, from sports to education, to fashion to technology, to finance to advertising, to architecture to cosmetics, and more. Observation of success and failure is often the best way to avoid pitfalls, learning from the mistakes of others to get on the pathway to success. This book doesn't disappoint, providing engaging and useful insights from the accounts of 16 entrepreneurs whose reflections are both personal to them and timeless in their significance for the rest of us. Pick up your copy of Entrepreneurial Living, 15 stories of innovation, risk, and achievement, and one story of abject failure by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com. And while you're online, please leave a review for the Open College Podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
And that brings us to today and why the history matters now. Our current reflections on the stain of slavery. We are, in the 21st century, part of the rare culture that has done the reflecting and the heavy lifting of fighting slavery. Being vigorously anti-slavery has become part of our moral identity. But there's still much bad feeling, nasty argumentation, and lots of accusations flying back and forth about slavery. So what is the correct lesson of history for us? And I think that in large part turns on asking the right questions about history. The question here, the right question, is not, what groups have slavery in their history, and let's beat up on them? That's not the right question, because the stain of slavery is on pretty much every group in history. The important question is, what groups initiated the fight against slavery? Who did the most to abolish it and eliminate it? And the astonishing thing here is that first it's only a few individuals and then a small number of cultures who first questioned and opposed and largely eliminated slavery. Those are the historically and morally interesting people and their descendants. Now, among all of the descendants here in the contemporary world groups, of course, if we scan the world, we find there are many cultures and nations around the world that don't much question or worry about their history of slavery and related bad deeds. I think that's an amoralism. There are some cultures that actively deny their groups and nations bad deeds historically, including their past practices of slavery and subjugation of others. That's a bad faith historically, and that's immoral. But there are a significant number of cultures that actively question and debate their own history of bad deeds, including slavery. This is most nations in Western civilization, and I think they are deserving of much moral credit for doing so. But there also is among us a group of those who selectively attack other groups for their history of bad deeds. For example, those who will say, for example, that Europeans, right, or Americans, or white people, or whatever, are especially evil for their history of slavery. And in this latter group, there is a perverseness that's worth investigating, in part because most of them are ignorant of history, but most importantly because I think for them morally is being deployed rather selectively and as a strategic weapon. It's perverse because morality can only be used as a weapon against people who take morality seriously in the first place, but too often the slavery history weapon is deployed to use people's sense of morality against against them. And a big part of the perverse strategy is especially prevalent among the enemies of the Enlightenment, the enemies of liberalism and capitalism, and that's perverse because it's the Enlightenment, liberalism, and capitalism that deserve most of the credit for eliminating slavery. But there's a question here about moral philosophy and how we properly apportion credit and blame, pride and shame. When we look to past generations, we should look at the individuals involved, the organizations that endorsed slavery, including governments. Any buyers and any slavers, any sellers of slavery, they're all equally morally responsible for the practice of slavery. We should identify those individuals, those organizations, and blame them. But on the other side, there are many individuals and organizations, including governments, that are involved who engaged in principled opposition to slavery. There's also, of course, in past, the slaves themselves. Those slaves who were willing to enslave, had the tide of history gone the other way in their favor, they do get some sympathy for their slave state, but the moral evaluation does not extend beyond that. Now, in this group then, Wilberforce, Franklin, and Jefferson, the judge in the Somerset case, and so forth, those individuals can be focused on, and moral credit mostly can be apportioned to them for their principled and early historical opposition to slavery. But we also should focus on groups, the British Parliament, and then the British Navy, the French National Convention, the Americans who participated in the Civil War, in large part in opposition to slavery. All of those groups get moral credit. Now, all of that group language above, though, we do need to be careful. Groups are always made up of subgroups with different beliefs and actions. We always have to remember that group language is a shorthand tag. So what that means is that we should not say, hey, Europeans get credit or Europeans get blamed for participating in slavery or ending slavery. We should not say white people get credit or blame for their participation or ending in slavery, or the British. In each case, the reason for that is that some Europeans, some whites and some British were opposed, but some were still in favor, and some were uncaring about the issue of slavery one way or other. There's no collectivized responsibility either for the credit or for the blame. So we always have to remember, for example, the British did X. That's a shorthand for some individuals who were British did X. And the point is a methodological individualism. Groups, as groups don't do things, groups do things to the extent that the individuals who make up those groups do those things. But there is still at the same time something to the culture and civilization language as a shorthand and as an abstraction. When a good belief or a good practice is widespread, a large number of individuals believe it and they commit to it, that is a cultural achievement. But we always have to be aware of forgetting that cultures are not collectivized organisms or entities themselves. They are collections of individuals. And that means that we also need to be aware of package deals and selective application. For example, when the very historical groups that should be getting the most credit are the ones that are now the most attacked. It's a double injustice. They don't get the credit that they do deserve, and on top of that, they get blame that is undeserved. But it also means that we have to be aware of making the same error in the other direction. We should not give credit universally to historical groups when many or some of the individuals in those groups don't deserve it.
The host of the Open College podcast, Dr. Stephen Hicks, is a renowned philosopher and author. His field of study and insights into postmodernism explain how it has become one of the most powerful intellectual movements of our time, and what that actually means. If you'd like to access more information from Dr. Hicks himself, then check out his website at www.stephenhicks.org. You'll be able to find details on his latest publications, courses, and philosophical information concerning business ethics, education, intellectual history, and religion. To stay up to date with the latest from Stephen Hicks himself, make sure you've subscribed to the Open College Podcast feed and follow at Open College Podcast on all your favourite social networks. And while you're online, please leave the show a review on iTunes and Stitcher.